Hi, I'm Meredith Schweitzer. I am the former curator of 19th and 20th century Southwest collections at the New Mexico History Museum. And I'm here with my really good friend, Jack Loeffler. Hopefully we're going to see how well this goes. We're going to do a curatorial reflection on Voices of Counterculture, which was an exhibit we did in 2017 and 2018. So I think that we're just going to kind of dive into it, but the idea here is we picked a couple of spots within the exhibit. For those of you watching, you can, we'll include a link at the end or in the notes or something for how to get to the online exhibit itself. And you can take as long as you want to kind of explore the exhibit and go through sections and really enjoy it. We just want to take some time to give you some insights from the curatorial perspective of kind of how we put the show together. Now looking back, things that kind of were meaningful to us and we hope are meaningful to you too. And I think we just kind of want to start at the beginning of the exhibit. One thing I'll say before I hand it over to Jack for a little bit is as the curator at the History Museum, one of the things that we all do is we have these extensive curatorial and exhibition planning meetings. And I think it was about 3 years before we launched this exhibit that we were all sitting around the table at the History Museum saying, the Summer of Love is coming up and how are we going to celebrate that? And so that's really the genesis of the idea of having an exhibit around counterculture in New Mexico. And I think what we came out with across those 3 years of development, or maybe it was 2.5, really went beyond a Summer of Love exhibit. I think the thing that became really important for Jack and I both was looking at how this idea of counterculture in the Southwest in particular was part of a trajectory and part of an evolution, and in a lot of ways was something that gave birth to the movements that are still important to New Mexicans today in terms of organic food and living off the land and really being in touch with the meaning of place. So I think, it was really special to work with Jack over this process. I'm sure he'll get into, how he came to New Mexico. But the fact that he sort of lived through this history and we were able to give voice to or allow for the voices of the people who were actually living through the cultural revolution in the Southwest in particular, could be heard in a way that went beyond, just sort of showing artifacts and having a nostalgic view of the 60s and 70s. And I think that having the voices themselves, which I think we have, Jack will correct me, but I think we have well over 20 people speaking in the exhibit itself. Having them be able to articulate the experiences and the meaning behind certain events was really special. So I just want to thank Jack for helping us get there in a really good way. It was such a pleasure working with him for the exhibit, and he's become a really good friend. So I think what we want to do is start in a specific spot. So I'm just going to hand it over to Jack. And Jack, do you want to give? It'd be nice if you gave kind of just a little sentence about how you came into the project and what was sort of important to you from the onset of working on this project.
Thank you. Well, indeed. And first of all, I want to say that I was honored and very flattered to have been invited to be your co-curator in this exhibition, Meredith, because it was a lot of fun. I have to say that in retrospect, after all these many years, that was to me the most meaningful exhibition I ever worked on. And it's especially relevant now in this time. And if we went to the beginning of it, from my perspective, it began in actually a very specific date. It was October the 7th, 1955, in San Francisco at the 6th Gallery, where a bunch of poets read. The poets included Philip Lamantia, Philip Whalen, Mike McClure, Gary Snyder, and Allen Ginsberg. The reading was hosted by Kenneth Rexroth, and it was also the first time that Allen Ginsberg read his well-known iconoclastic poem, Howl. And there you see photographs of 3 of those 5 poets. On the left is Gary Snyder, in the middle is Allen Ginsberg, and to the right is Philip Whalen. And we collected a lot of sound for this exhibition. We did have over 20 people speaking, well over 20, but we had approximately 100 sound excerpts scattered throughout the exhibition that really reflected the perspectives of these people who all truly participated in the extent of the counterculture. And so, from my perspective, it really did begin with the beat scene, the West Coast beat scene in 1955, that also corresponded to the West Coast literary renaissance at the same time. And the beat poets, whom I've mentioned just now, of them all, Gary Snyder does not regard himself as a beat poet as much as a poet who was associated with the beats, but who also was more naturistic. And I think we can actually listen to Gary right now, if we wish, talking about his sense of the genesis of the counterculture.
Well, so it's only, from one perspective, and that is like a Western American perspective of the combination of enlightenment, skepticism and atheism, political anti-racism, cultural anti-racism, a touch of paganism and nature, and a touch of Native American tradition, and a touch of the European political left. All of those went toward making and drawing on Thoreau and Emerson in the process too, making a stance that we all felt strong in. I'll tell you what it was in part, when I think back about it. It came into existence in part to resist doctrinaire Marxist Communist Party politics. Some of my friends joined the party. Some of my friends simply became doctrinaire Marxists. I did not. I was tempted when I was around 19 and 20, but I didn't go for it for long, because when I talked to them about art, about nature, and about the spiritual world, I lost them. And they was totally dismissive, didn't connect. And so I said, well, whatever they are doing that I politically sympathize with, there's some deeper things that are very important to me that they can't do and won't do. And so I'm not tempted that direction much at all. And that's the beginning of the counterculture.
Yes. Well,
the beginning of the counterculture is discovering another path, another choice away from capitalism other than European Marxist, communist ideas, enlightenment ideas. And it's more artistic and it's more psychological. Yes. It allows for the mind and it allows for art. It allows for
one of the things I'd like to mention there is that also coincided, I just thought of the other day, with the McCarthy era, where a lot of artists and intellectuals, screenwriters were blacklisted and basically put out of business, including people like Pete Seeger and Dalton Trumbo, who was one of the great screenwriters of the time. And so it coincided with that. It coincided with the end of World War II. As Philip Whalen said, the term beat generation was originated when John Cleland Holmes, who was a novelist in New York City, actually was talking to Jack Kerouac and said, well, we had the lost generation after the First World War. How would you term this generation? And according to Philip Whalen, Jack said, well, let's call it the beat generation because we're all beat, we're broke, we're just out there trying to figure out how to make it work, and it's a tough time. And so that was the genesis of the beat literary generation, and also it just set up, to me, what really was the beginning of what was later termed by Theodore Roszak in 1969 as the counterculture. And so that's the beginning of it. Maybe we could go on inside.
Yeah, and I think it's really important as you're kind of navigating us inside. I think it's important to reiterate that point, Jack, that, like I said at the beginning of this, that we really saw, you know, what we wanted to talk about in the context of New Mexico as part of that path that had origins in some ways on the West Coast in particular, and some in the East Coast as well. But for us, I think that finding this poster from the original reading of Howell, the Gallery 6 poster, was on loan from an organization in California and out of Berkeley. Well, actually, I think it's from the DeYoung Museums, one of the DeYoung Museum special collections. Was really special because I think it kind of epitomizes the ephemeral nature of that moment, that there aren't, you know, a lot of artifacts related to this sort of turning point, but this piece that is intended to be an ephemeral, you know, poster announcing the reading, kind of stands for that aspect of the way that things, you know, moments in history happen without us intending to document them necessarily, and they can be big moments, and sometimes you have these small pieces of ephemera to capture them in some way. So it's really special to track down that piece in particular, and to be able to share that with as the kind of entry point into the exhibit.
And then if we bear left and actually enter the exhibition hall,
then it gets really groovy.
It is so beautiful. We could stop there for just a second, because on the left-hand side, you see a whole slew of wonderful posters from that period. As Meredith said, initially the whole context for the exhibition began with the Summer of Love, and it exploded. At least in our minds, it exploded, because the Summer of Love actually exploded all the way over into New Mexico. Now, there had been a real sense of continuity between the Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, etc., and northern New Mexico for quite some time, because bear in mind that there was a very powerful bohemian element that landed here back before the 1920s when Babel Dodge Lujan arrived. And so bohemianism was not new to New Mexico.
Right.
But what was really new out there on the West Coast, and some of the things that are reflected on, for example, there on the left-hand side, well, we can barely see there. That's okay. There was a photograph of the Human Be-In with Gary Snyder, Mike McClure, Lenore Condell, Allen Ginsberg is there. That photograph was taken by Lisa Law, who really documented an enormous amount of the entire counterculture over many, many, many years. And she has long lived here in New Mexico. But after the beginnings of the Haight-Ashbury scene went through their own sense of permutations in the Bay Area, which these posters reflect, according to people like Freeman House, who was one of the early people in the Bay Area, the communes began in the Bay Area. And when it became apparent that they were going to need more than city space and places like Marin County to expand into, there was this big migration that came to northern New Mexico. And one of the things that brought a lot of people here was the presence of the Native American people. And one of the great spurs of the entire countercultural scene was the use of peyote, the mushrooms that came from southern Mexico, and LSD, acid, marijuana. These became important things. And this peyote teepee here was prominent throughout northern New Mexico throughout that period. You can see a picture there in front of it, a photograph of little Joe Gomez, who was a peyotero who lived at the Taos Pueblo. He was the head of the peyote clan there, and he taught a lot of the people who would eventually settle into the communes like New Buffalo and Lama and others, what it meant to get into the peyote mindset and the spiritual relationship of the way we practice our cultures in the context of the habitat itself. In other words, he pointed out, as the peyote pointed out to so many of us, that the planet is a sacred place and it should not be vilified. Behind us is a row of Huichol yarn paintings. The Huicholes live in west central Mexico in the Sierra Madre Occidental. And back in the 60s, I had the occasion to live in the village of San Andres de Comyata with the peyote people up there at the time of their annual peyote fiesta. And these various yarn paintings portray visions that the people would have after they had ingested peyote. Mescaline is the psychoactive ingredient in peyote, and it invigorates an entire spiritual, visual, and it's a realm that you feel deep in your heart and soul. And so we were very fortunate to be able to exemplify in some way what peyote actually means. We could listen to Peter Coyote, who is one of the great counterculturalists of our time, talking about how he changed his name as a result of having taken peyote. Peter Coyote. Maybe we could play that.
We ate peyote, had about 6 or 7 big, fat, juicy buttons each. Everybody just was transported into another zone. As soon as I went outside, hey, this is really weird, man, but I feel like I'm some kind of little wolf. And I started to pant, and I started to dog trot. And I dog trotted all night long out in the woods in the silvery moonlight and under the starlight and licking the tip of my nose to get sensitive to smells. And at dawn, when I woke up in the morning, the ground was muddied with these little tracks. And I didn't know if I had made those footprints or not. Then I met this guy, Rolling Thunder. He was a Shoshone Paiute guy. He had real power. And one day I told him this story about the peyote trip. He pinned me, man. He looked at me. He said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I said, I don't know. What do you mean? He said, well, the universe offered you a great gift. It opened its mind to you. You can treat it as a hallucination. He said, or you can take it as a great gift and you have to respond to it. I thought about it for about 6 months. I decided what I would do is I would take that name and I would find out what it meant. So Coyote sort of gave me a space to be somebody that Peter Cohan was never going to be able to be. Peter Cohan came with so many expectations and middle-class upbringing, and it was very hard to slip that web of expectations. But somehow, as Peter Coyote, it was like a clean slate.
I love that clip. I love that clip, Jack. I think it's so, I think it really is so good at illustrating how we were really trying to figure out a way to go beyond sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know, we were really looking at, yes, the music is extremely important, and yes, the drugs were important, but they were in many ways not like this frivolous taking of drugs that we often see visualized in things documenting counterculture or the 60s, that they were that people had meaningful connections to the earth, and that they, you know, that taking peyote or other drugs, you know, had spiritual and artistic consequences too, that live beyond, you know, a single drug experience.
I totally agree. And one of the things that I really feel is a lot of the people who documented the whole scene about hippies were all coming from the straight world. And what we tried to do was reflect on what the people here in New Mexico did. And there was high intelligence here and high systems of ethical standards that were really elevated. It was a different perception whatsoever of the normal middle class perception of what the counterculture was all about. Like there were, we as I recall, we put together exhibition in the design 7 different of the communes that existed here. We both, well, we went to some of them. The one that really got to both of us big time was Lama. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, so, and Jack, let's just say what the 7 spots were, because you have that in front of you.
I've got the list right here.
Tell everybody what the 7 were. And I want to encourage people, I mean, we're only touching on just a few of these little points, and you can go through this exhibit on your own and actually read through the panels and listen to the audio and really get into each of these audio alcoves where we're talking about each kind of area and each movement. So I would really encourage people to do that in the space itself with this interactive exhibit. But I thought that Lama Foundation in particular is so important that we really give it its due in this exhibit for so many reasons. And Jack, we can kind of get into the founding of Lama if you want to, but Lama is one of the few alternative kind of living experiments that is still in existence in New Mexico. It celebrated its 50th anniversary while the exhibit was open, which was really special. They are really if you're not familiar with Lama, it's located just outside of Taos up in the mountains, and they're kind of known visually for 2 things. One is this beautiful geodesic dome where they have a lot of their programs, and you'll see a lot of the photographs that were taken during the period when it was founded are in the dome or right outside of the dome, and that space is still up there and is just, it's beautiful and it's really spiritually touching. And so it's important to us, and I think a challenge for our amazing exhibit designers, Caroline Lajoie and Natalie Baca, to figure out how to construct a geodesic dome in, a traditional exhibition space. So that was kind of a fun exercise. And so within the exhibit right now, if you're seeing the screen share, we're standing in the center of this mock geodesic dome, looking at drawings that were done by the residents of Lama at the time in the late 60s, that are the transcription of a talk given by Ram Dass, who Jack, you can talk about who he is if you'd like. That were then laid out on the floor of the geodesic dome, and everyone who was living as part of Lama at the time participated in illustrating these statements or the transcript of the talk, which then was turned into one of the most, I think, iconic books of the time, Be Here Now, which anyone who's interested in this history at all has either owned or read or knows about. And originally it came as this little box set that they would mail to you for, I think, I can't remember if it was like
50 cents.
I think it was 25 or 50 cents, right? Wasn't it, Jack?
50 cents.
And you would get the Bidu de Oha book and a few other things, a record of the talk that is the Ram Dass speaking. And we were really lucky. If you've tried to hunt down these original boxes, it's nearly impossible. We didn't have one in our collection. And in fact, most of the organizations, museums that I reached out to didn't have a complete set. They're usually missing the record or they're missing some piece of it. And this wonderful guy, Lex Gillum, from California, reached out to us, and he was actually a yoga instructor who had been through Lama and was sort of just this delightful person, had a complete set, and we were able to exhibit it here. And then along with the original pieces, which had never been seen in public before, we spent quite a bit of time working with the Lama Foundation's current board and people who were living there during the exhibition development, to be able to exhibit those original drawings. And that was, I think, one of the most special things for me, to be able to share that with the public. They're just stunning drawings, and they're all so different. And you can really see the collective nature of that project. And Lama Foundation, like I said, it's celebrated its 50th anniversary. But Jack, can you, because you were so well acquainted with the founders, with Sadiq and with his sister, and all of the folks who were the sort of the original Lama people. Can you talk a little? Are we going to play the one clip?
Yeah, we will. But I would like to mention a bit
good.
about that, because it was the real founders of Lama included Barbara and Steve Durkee and Jonathan Altman. Those were the big three. And they were able to find some acreage on the side of Lama Mountain, north of Taos, up in the mountains. And that's where they did it. And they had an enormous amount of help from the Indians from the Taos Pueblo. Like I mentioned earlier, Little Joe Gomez, and especially his son, Henry Gomez, and his wife, Susie, they helped enormously with putting Lama together. Among the original members of the board, one was Stuart Brand, who did the Whole Earth catalog. Another was Richard Alpert, who became Baba Ramdas. Barbara and Steve were two others. Jonathan Altman was one. I was one. An artist who was in Santa Cruz, California at that time was one, a guy named Gerd Stern. And those were some of the original founders. I think there were some others, but the upshot is that it was truly a communal experience. One of the people from Taos, New Mexico, who got very into it and became really one of their shining lights was Sylvia Rodriguez. She's now got her PhD and has taught at the University of New Mexico in anthropology for many years. But she remembers Lama with tears in her eyes, the great beauty of it all. And what I'd like is to listen to Barbara Durkee, now known as Asha Greer, when she talks about how it was when permaculture came to Lama. This will really give a sense of what that spirit was.
When the permaculture movement came, we were all about spiritual. We were all about realization and waking up and all of that. And then the permaculture religion came up to Lama, and so taking care of the land became what the work was. And the spiritual stuff was seen as kind of ancillary to it. I mean, I don't know exactly how a place like Lama, for instance, can continue, given the kind of soil that's there. I don't think people can feed themselves, but there is a place down the hill that does have a community garden. And I think the community gardens are really the answer for how to work, particularly for this generation and the next generation who are not used to working hard. That having grown up in Los Angeles, number one, I didn't know anything much about seasons. And I certainly didn't know about phases of the moon or the sun and its movement and the shortened days. I mean, I knew about it from school, but it's so tragic that everybody cannot follow just 4 seasons of 3 months each. If not for any other reason, to understand the world's poetry, what it feels like in the spring if you've been through a winter. Having picked your own food and harvested and eating your own food off of the plants, that was a very large thing that happened for us. And I guess I'd have to say that the counterculture movement, because we got involved with acid quite early in the psychedelic movement, that opening up to the natural world in the way that one is one with it, that those aren't nouns out there, all those plants. Those aren't trees out there. There's this whole energy field that's so awake that I think that that kind of worked at all of our underbellies, you know, to bring us alive to the possibilities, you know, in the Coyote Church too. That we had been also kind of programmed to be rationalists, you know, and scientists, and believe in progress as though progress was making more gadgets, more machines, more people. And of course, the Malthusian question about overpopulation, here we are. What are we now? 7.5 billion.
Yeah, Barbara really nailed it there. I'd like to just mention the other communes just quickly in passing. They included Libre, which is up in the Huerfano Valley of southern Colorado, and then there was New Buffalo, the Reality Construction Company, the Hog Farm, the Sikh community founded by Yogi Bhajan near Espanola, Placitas, which is about 20 miles northeast of Albuquerque, and Lama. And so those are the 7 communes that are exhibited in the exhibition, and with a lot of artifacts and a lot of photographs reflecting what they looked like, and also the voices of people who lived there and worked there. And so that gives a real sense, like Barbara talking about when permaculture came and how it affected everybody. That was a spiritual thing of magnitude, and that happened just about everywhere. You know, that sense of relating to the landscape in a bigger, more beautiful way than we're normally accustomed to doing. So anyway, then we passed on into another later aspect of the exhibition.
Oh, wait, Jack, let's stay in here for a second. I think it would be nice to pop into the audio alcove there, Chris. I just want to scan those photos to give people a sense of the community. And what we tried to do with each of the spaces and each of the movements was really give a sense of an immersive sense of the experience of being at those locations. You know, so you really get these beautiful photos from Ahad Kab and from Lisa Law and from a couple other people.
Sadiq.
There's a couple from Sadiq in here. Just of the unique perspective that each of these places gave to the milieu of New Mexico's kind of experience of this. And I think that whole thought of thinking of how, you know, being connected to the land was something that was so important to Asha in that clip. You know, we do set up in the exhibit the national kind of cultural and political context that all of this is happening in. But we don't harp on that. You know, I think that's something that a lot of the other shows that we were looking at as comparisons or thinking about, that's where the focus was, you know, big on the Vietnam War and on, you know, the politics of the time. And what we were trying to do was get a little past that top level narrative to look at the individual experiences and the individual voices. And that's why I think it was so important that we were able to let people speak for themselves. You know, you really get a sense of the experience listening to Asha there, you know, in a way that I think was important for us. I just think that's something that is you see in the other areas of the exhibit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The voices of the people. Well, that's a lot of it's what the exhibition was, is people telling their sense of what the counterculture meant to them. And it wasn't restricted to people who had moved into northern New Mexico from either coast. For example, there was a very powerful Hispano part of counterculture that happened. That, for example, a man named Tomás Atencio actually created the notion of la nueva raza, the new race, because indeed Hispano Nuevo Mexico is unique in that it's a mestizaje, a mixture of not just cultural perspective, but even bloodline. And that's what Tomas brought out, and Tony Mares brought out, and Enrique Lamadrid brought out. What Enrique had to say about querencia, for example, the love of the land, is something that is so beautifully Hispano and so deeply rooted in this landscape. And the same goes for the Native American people who we tried to portray in this. There are people, well, the pueblos that line the northern Rio Grande, I think of them as gardens of consciousness, but that's just me.
I love that.
But that's what it seems like to me. And we actually included people from places like the Santa Clara Pueblo. We included Rena Swensel's perspective. And we also, in the Vietnam War part of it, we included this beautiful sculpture that was rendered by Michael Naranjo, Rena's brother.
Oh, can we go there? Let's go there and look at it.
That's such a great place.
I know we're going off script here, guys.
Yeah, but this is one of the great pieces of sculpture, and it's right.
Yeah, you just turn around.
Going around in the circle.
Do.
There it is, right there. This was rendered by Michael Naranjo, and who was in Vietnam, in combat in Vietnam, and he's portraying in this sculpture a soldier carrying his friend who's either dead or been wounded back, and it's called My Buddy. But what's really far out to me, and to Meredith, I'm sure, is that when Michael was in Vietnam, in combat, and there's an entire account of this in Michael's own words, he tells about how he was there fighting in a gun battle, and somebody threw a grenade, and it blinded him. And he rendered this sculpture blind. He does it all with his fingers. And it's so beautiful and so poignant. And so we've included a very long piece by Michael telling the entire story of that battle in Vietnam and what came out of it. In other words, his blindness, but also a great sense of compassion that he feels and tells about. Other people talk about their Vietnam experiences, both women and men talk about their sense of what happened. Roberta Price and Lisa Law and John Brandy and others talking about what it meant during that time. And we've forgotten a lot about that time. And then there was such a sense of cultural foment going on just then. It also included the American Indian movement too. And we were fortunate to get to meet Tara Trudell, who was the daughter of John Trudell, who was sort of the head of the American Indian movement for some time. Some of us may distantly recall that he did a radio series when the Indians took over Alcatraz, way back in those days. And she tells John's story. And then another big thing that we really thought about a lot was how so much of the modern environmental movement came out of the counterculture movement. They coalesced, and if it were possible, we could move over to the Four Changes panel, because there are two people who speak there. One is Melissa Savage, who talks about how different streams of the counterculture resulted in different things. If we could play Melissa, and then she introduces Gary Snyder reading part of this a beautiful piece of literature that he composed in 1969 called The Four Changes, which is one of the most profound pieces of writing, period, to come out of the 20th century, in my opinion.
Well, and I think it's so relevant right now. Like, I just think in the context of this pandemic that we're living in, I think just where he was coming from, 50 years ago, it's right in line with what we should be thinking about now.
It's amazing. I want to say that earlier this month, Gary turned 90 years old. He's the last of the beat poets.
There were so many of us. There were so many people doing so many different kinds of things. I mean, the way I experienced the San Francisco counterculture at the time was that it was many braided strands of involvement. And I kind of immediately got trained in the environmental aspect of it. But across the bay, there were the Black Panthers in full swing, and there were SDS people. Many of these strands had very little overlap with one another, very little overlap. But they all had things in common. And that's one of the reasons the term counterculture has relevance for me. Also, subculture. I mean, the subculture always exists. And I really think of the roots of the 60s subculture starting with the Romantics, nearly a century before the Bohemians. I mean, there's this theme in human culture has been around for a long time, in Western culture anyway. So I got involved with Heath Lampy, Ponderosa Pine, who had changed his name to Ponderosa Pine by that time, which was an outrageous thing to do. And he was sending out a newsletter once a month that was pretty radical environmental thinking to a group of his addressees that he thought should hear the message. They weren't soliciting his message. And so I was plunged immediately into sort of the extreme part of the environmental movement, which was radical. He was very good friends with Gary, and Gary would come to the house and sit and talk with other people about the philosophy. And I remember sitting in the shadows and listening to conversation among maybe 5 people, including Gary, in which they were developing the basis for the little document called The 4 Changes. And that was probably in '69, where radical environmentalism was at that moment.
4 Changes. Roman numeral 1. Population. Part 1. The condition. Position. Human beings are but a part of the fabric of life, dependent on the whole fabric for their very existence. As the most highly developed tool-using animal, we must recognize that the unknown evolutionary destinies of other life forms are to be respected, and we must act as gentle stewards of the Earth's community of being. Situation. There are now too many human beings, and the problem is growing rapidly worse. It is potentially disastrous, not only for the human race, but for most other life forms. Goal. The goal would be half of the present world population or less. Action. Social political. First, a massive effort to convince the government and leaders of the world that the problem is severe, and that all talk about raising food production, well-intentioned as it is, simply puts off the only real solution, reduced population. Demand immediate participation by all countries in programs to legalize abortion, encourage vasectomy, sterilization, provided by free clinics, and try to correct traditional cultural attitudes that tend to force women into childbearing. Remove income tax deductions for more than 2 children above a specified income level, and scale it so that lower-income families are forced to be careful too, or pay families to limit their number.
We cut it off there. It goes on for several more minutes. Actually, the entirety of the 4 Changes is a little over a half an hour, but bear in mind that Gary wrote that in 1969 when the human population was less than half than what it is now. In other words, he wanted to have that population to more like a world population of 1.5 billion, which is what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. And so that was what he was aiming for. And so to me, what Gary wrote, this is one of the reasons we really wanted to include this, is that what he wrote is as relevant now, if not even more so, than it was 50 years ago. when it first came out.
Yeah,
And,
definitely.
and from there, we kind of went into another aspect of the evolution of the environmental movement as took place here in New Mexico in the Southwest, which included voices of some of the great environmentalists, who some of whom are still with us, like Dave Foreman. Edward Abbey is no longer with us, but he was in there talking about it, and others who really participated in it, including Roxanne Swenzel, who is the daughter of Rena Swenzel, who is a terrifically well-known potter in her own right, but what she has done goes far and beyond that of the artist that she is. She actually has reinvigorated the whole notion of what Aisha Greer or Barbara Durkee called permaculture. Actually, Roxanne is one of the great practitioners of permaculture in New Mexico, and she was re-teaching the art and act of permaculture to the young Native American people of her pueblo, Santa Clara Pueblo, Kapowawinge. And if it's okay with you, Meredith, maybe we could hear a little bit of Roxanne talk about that too, because she's a Native American voice alive and well today.
Yeah, let's listen to her.
We were going to groups that were also doing permaculture stuff and learning. And what I loved about it was that it fit into how I was brought up here, connecting to place. And the more I got into it, I started with this big idea of it like an earth movement, which it is, and the concept of looking at your environment where you are and using what you had in that place to help yourself make a richer, more sustaining place. And for me, it was an obvious 1, 2, 3 step into my culture more, because who were the original permaculturists here? It was the Pueblo people. And the Pueblo people had figured out how to live in this environment. And it's not an easy environment because it's high desert. And all these other permaculture groups, I would always be envious. It's like Hawaii. They got rain, they got long season, they got, all this kind of stuff. We got the cold, the short season, the dry, the hot. We had like all the worst parts here. But my people had figured out how to live here for thousands of years, sustainably. And I realized I needed to learn more what that was about, which was easy because I already was interested. Pieces were falling into place pretty fast at that point, like, I have it right here, right in front of me. So it's just been a process of learning more and more about my culture, Pueblo culture, historically, what's left today, and then actually trying to put back what I've learned back into what we've lost. And it's been, my drive, my purpose.
And that was Roxanne Swenzel talking about teaching the young people in her pueblo about permaculture, which is what Aisha Greer or Barbara Durkee talked about, that Lama and so many people have, and that remains. And it's what's really important to me is seeing how this system of ethics that evolved and this system of a spiritual attitude toward this place, the spirit of place, is what to me is probably at least one of the most important aspects of the counterculture. Yes, indeed, it was in part a reaction to the political milieu, the cultural milieu that was totally involved in capitalism and consumerism that really was foisted upon us right after the end of the Second World War. But it evolved into something far bigger than that, a far bigger perspective, a sphere of reference rather than a frame of reference. And it's from that so much of it still remains here in northern New Mexico. We have been the receptacle of some of the most visionary thinking and the most beautiful people that America has ever yielded. And it all came together right here. And what I would strongly suggest that after we have gone through this beautiful virtual exhibition, that we stand outside and look at this landscape that spawned that. And now over to Meredith.
Well, that was a really great way to kind of just give some highlights of what we got into with the exhibit. Again, I mean, we worked on the exhibit for almost 3 years. I think the biggest thing for us was to figure out ways to elevate the voices of people who were so important in so many different aspects of the movements. And you and I, Jack, often talked about kind of the ripple effects of the counterculture in New Mexico. And I think what we do so nicely at the conclusion of the exhibit is give a nod to that through the modern environmental movement, through some of the Native American activism that's still strong in New Mexico, some of the Hispanic heritage aspects that are also, so relevant to what's happening in New Mexico today. And so I think being able to give voice to individuals in this way was really special, and I'm glad that you were able to work with me on this, and it was just such a pleasure to work on the exhibit together. And thank you for everyone who chose to watch and listen to us ramble for 45 minutes about what was important to us. And again, I really encourage everyone to take the time to go through and listen to the areas that are most interesting to you personally. I think there's something for everyone in the exhibit, and that it still stands up, a couple of years later. And I hope that, we always talk about, when we get together, Jack and I talk about this idea of a new wave of counterculture. And I hope that, that being at home and having to reflect on what's important in our lives in terms of family and the economy and health and all of the things that we're all weighing within the context of the COVID pandemic, that maybe this is a turning point that we can look at and think about and inspire people to revisit some of these themes that we all explored, in this crucial kind of cultural moment 50 years ago. So with that, thank you, and I'll let Jack sign off as well. But thanks for joining us.
There were so many people who contributed to our exhibition, Voices of Counterculture in the Southwest, that they cannot all go name, but some of the photography that came into this exhibition really helped convey the way it was. And key photographers who contributed to this included Lisa Law, who really is one of the great photo documentarians of her time, and her work flashing on the 60s is eternal. Seth Rothman, who has really lived so many inches and miles and eons of the whole counterculture and environmental movement, took a lot of the photographs. Meredith Davidson took photographs. Roberta Price, who was part of the Libre commune, really did a lot of wonderful photography. Actually, she was featured at the very beginning of the exhibition, standing there holding up a bunch of marijuana plants while nude, looking out over the Libre commune. Also, Robert D'Alessandro contributed a lot of, not just photographs, but a lot of very provocative thoughts that he included. He has been in Placitas now for many, many years and is really one of the great counterculturalists who lives there. And I wanted to mention Hans von Briesen, otherwise known as Sadiq, who contributed so many wonderful photographs from Lama. He, by the way, is Asha Greer's brother, and he himself was one of the great contributors to the founding of Lama back in 1967. So all of these people contributed so greatly, so many of the voices of people. Gee whiz, they're just too numerous to mention, but voices appear throughout the exhibition. You can listen as you wish, and you can listen to people's ways of approaching their sense of counterculture within the context of the commune they happen to live in or the situation they found themselves in. Not all of the counterculturalists were communards, as the word goes. Some of us were more loners. I, for example, spent a lot of that time on top of a fire lookout up in northwestern New Mexico. There was no tower, just a great big flat piece of Navajo sandstone. And people like Barbara and Steve Durkee would come up and visit, or John Kimmy would come up, Stuart Brand would come up, on. And so much foment happened out in remote places like that. So there was no hippie counterculturalist cookie cutter that stamped out hippie after hippie. It was a great series of remarkable individuals who came together to provide what became the great counterculture. And boy, do I hope that we get a new one fast. Thank you.